Well, greetings, students. It's good to see you. Although, as you can see, I'm not sitting in front of a computer. I'll explain that at another time if time is applicable and able. I'm sitting in front of my cell phone. So I'm going to do my best to use my notes today so that I can be succinct and I can be very respectful of your time. I do apologize. I have created this snapshot video for week three times, and all three times it failed. I tried to reduce the size. I contacted tech support. So it continues to be a problem, and my internet was down, and so I couldn't send it through YouTube, so now I'm trying it with my phone. So let's go ahead and look quickly at what we covered last week, and then we'll take a brief look at what we are currently covering, which began week 4 this week. Let me first say congratulations to each of you for successfully making it through week 3. I know there was a lot of work. I have been praying and lifting you daily in my prayers. I have sincerely asked God to provide you the wisdom. Hopefully, you guys had a moment to look in the add-on section. I posted a prayer by the title, A Prayer Before Study. It's a prayer that I used to often use. It's seeking God and asking Him for wisdom, to open my mind to what I didn't understand, open to my mind to what I couldn't see, and open my ears to always hear Him. I also daily read in my devotional Psalm 32:8, which says, "Lead me and guide me in the way I should go, God. Please counsel me with your eye upon me." And of course, Solomon in his wisdom in the book of Proverbs wrote a lot of proverbs about wisdom is better than gold or silver. And so I pray for your wisdom, I pray for your strength, and I pray for you to realize that you are going to make it through. All right, let's turn into notes. Again, please excuse the aesthetics of this video as well as me looking back and forth. What did we look at last week? We looked at the Christian narrative. There were 4 parts of the Christian narrative, and we're probably all pretty familiar with those, so I'll go quite quickly, although I'll do my best so that you can understand me. The first part is the creation story, which we know is found specifically in Genesis 1 and 2. It just simply states that everything was created by God for God's purpose. Everything was created in perfect peace, and Shelley and Miller refer to this as the shalom, meaning that God's peace was what He created in the beginning. It was order, and it was peace, and it was purposeful. The second part of the Christian narrative is the fall. That can be found in Genesis 3. Here we have where order was broken, and we know what happened when Adam and Eve transgressed against what God had told them to do. Sin entered the picture. And through one man's sin, we all have sinned. But thank God when we get to the theology of the cross, which is found in Hebrews 9 through 11, through one man's grace, through the blood, one man's blood, once and for all, we have eternal salvation for those who profess in His name. So the second part of the Christian narrative was the fall. Order was broken in sin. What happened was, many scholars say the shalom was a brokenness because the relationship was broken between God and man that was originally a peaceful and perfect relationship. The third part of the Christian narrative was redemption. And this part just really continues about what happens after the corruption, after the fall. And it's God's plan to restore us back to Him. Although if we fell, it is always God's plan to restore us back to Him. So the fourth part of the Christian narrative is restoration. Often that's sometimes referred to as the telos, the goal, the end, the completion. It's the not yet fully realized time. We all know that the parousia, the second coming of Christ, indicates that is when Christ will set all things in order and He will return and bring all things under His rule. And so this restoration period is not yet fully realized, but it will again be realized when Christ comes. The next thing we looked at was a couple of the practices of three Christian practices. The first was prayer, and we all pray. I hope and pray we all pray. That's kind of redundant, but nevertheless, I'm a little tired tonight, so bear with me, please. Prayer is simply a communication with God. I think it is one of the most intimate ways in which we can relate to our Father. The second Christian practice was Scripture. We know that we have the Scriptures as a record of not just a historical record of a relationship with God and His people, but it also gives us a reminder of who God is, the character of God, the love of God. And the third Christian practice that we talked about was worship. We worship God. We adore God. I used to have a professor, who was the dean, who said we shouldn't have praise and worship in our churches. We should have worship and praise, because one must begin to worship one and know him through worship before he can praise him. That was just one of his thoughts. So those are the three Christian practices. I want to say something about that in relation to spirituality. One of my favorite theologians goes by the name of Nicholas Thomas Wright. However, you Google him, his name is generally, when he pens his book, is N.T. Wright, which is for Nicholas Thomas Wright. Nicholas Thomas Wright talks about worship and spirituality in this way, and I'm going to quote him. He said, one of the basic laws of spirituality is that we become like that to whom we worship. I shall repeat that. One of the basic laws of spirituality is that we become like that to whom we worship. I thought this was important and relevant to the Christian narrative, because in the Christian narrative we worship God and his Son, Jesus Christ, our Redeemer. And so our actions, and specifically in this context, your actions as a healthcare professional, should reflect the one in whom you worship. And so as many of you put in the paradigm, the healing hospital, it's not always easy to be a nurse. Well, discipleship is not easy. Remember, Christ said, take up your cross and follow me. And so I just want us to remember that people often don't hear Christ in their daily lives. Sometimes who we are to them can be the greatest voice and the greatest presence of Christ. Mother Teresa was always attributed as saying that we are the hands and feet of Jesus Christ. We are the hand and feet of Jesus Christ. And so that's something I wanted to talk to you about. Another Christian practice that was not something that Shelley and Miller specifically cited is one of my favorites, and we've been kind of following this thread, and especially as nurses. It's called the practice of presence. Presence often gets underrated, because especially in the healthcare institutions which you work, there's always someone doing something. It's empirical data that they're looking for. It's rightfully so. It's quantitative in nature. But the problem is that when you are a nurse who holds the hand, changes the bedpan, caresses the head of a young child who has to get a needle, those kind of things, when your presence is there, that presence is vital. It may not be able to be quantitative, and it may not generate empirical data that can get grants and more fundings. But what you're doing again is you're being the hands and feet of Jesus Christ. You are the incarnational presence of Jesus Christ. Christ dwells in you, and people need to see that. If again we remember what Nicholas Thomas Wright said, one of the basic laws of spirituality is that we become like that we worship. So one of my favorite books, and that's going to be difficult to show you the title, but I'm going to try. That was the price tag on the back. It's a little pocket-sized book, and it's called The Gift of Presence, A Guide to Helping Those Who Suffer. A Gift of Presence, A Guide to Helping Those Who Suffer. The author is Joe Purnell Jr. A Gift of Presence, A Guide to Helping Those Who Suffer. One of you put in the post that you wish that I would provide these resources in a list. Sometimes I'm not even thinking about the resources till I'm actually doing the video. I will be providing some resources, though, on our subject this week, and I'll talk about that momentarily. But let me read a quote from Reverend Purnell, who has served over 40 years as a pastor and a chaplain. So I'm sure that we can use him as understanding that he's been with people in his presence representing Christ. He says, the Christian doctrine of incarnation is foundational to the ministry of presence. Just as God's love for us was incarnate in Jesus Christ, so also we strive to emulate and embody the love of God as we reach out to be with others. By being the hands and feet of Christ, the Word becomes flesh as we are present to those who suffer. I'm going to repeat that last sentence. By being the hands and feet of Christ, the Word becomes flesh and we are present to those who suffer. The ministry of presence is a way of being rather than a way of doing or telling. As we prepare to be with those who suffer, we should not think about what to say or what to do. We should not anticipate how we might react if certain situations should develop. Instead, we should inwardly prepare ourselves to focus on the here and now with feeling and care. We should go with the earnest desire to emotionally participate in the space of those who suffer. That's a hard concept to think about. As a chaplain, I said we will often call the intimate stranger, because we intentionally went into the space of people suffering and sat with them. And so this is what this little handbook is all about the presence of ministry is a way of being rather than doing. You guys do a lot in this healthcare professionals. Sometimes don't underrate being with that young child who is afraid, being with the mother who is about to lose a baby, being with parents whose child has gotten bad news, being with an elderly patient who may be alone in the hospital, being there when no one else is able to be there. Take pride in that, for you are the hands and feet of Jesus Christ. Well, the last thing we looked at last week real quickly is we had to do a case study on a fetal abnormality. So we looked at what is the moral status and what theories determine moral status. So there were, in your readings, from your assigned readings, there were 5 specific moral theories that we can live. The first was cognition. Cognition is simply the ability to know, to think, and to understand. Hence, when we say we're cognitive, we're aware of something. The second theory was autonomy. This is the ability to be free from other people's thoughts and to make one's own decisions. Hence, we say that people are autonomous. Like a particular denomination, the Baptist denomination is autonomous. They're not tied to any system of hierarchy as opposed to like the Roman Catholic tradition. The third theory is the human properties. This theory usually says that every human being has a moral status. And the fourth is called all life is sacred. This values that every life has a meaning. Every life is considered to be sacred, regardless of the stage that it's in. The next theory was sentiments. This simply means that this theory believes that in order to have a moral status, the individual has to be able to feel, to think subjectively, and to have a presence. And the last one was scientism, and this is simply where we saw Dr. Wilson at work. Now, there seem to be a couple of problems for some students with understanding the theory. It's a little different than a worldview. A worldview can inform our theory, but a worldview is how we see things through a particular lens, in this context through a Christian lens. But a theory is something we know that's relatively been proven to be true. We apply that theory to learn something. So these 5 theories that we just talked about, cognition, autonomy, human property, all life is sacred, sentiments, and scientism. These theories are what influences or helps a person determine what the moral status is. So let's look at Dr. Wilson. He used the theory of scientism. With that theory helped him determine that he felt that fetus, unfortunately, the moral status of the fetus was that it wouldn't be viable, and so therefore it should terminate in an abortion. The mother, on the other hand, if I'm not mistaken, her name was Jessica. Jessica valued, I think we could say there were 2 theories at work there, and there's nothing wrong with that. There could be 2 theories at work. Jessica valued that all life is sacred, and she believed that fetus, although there was a chance that it would be born with abnormalities, that fetus was sacred in the eyes of God. And so therefore her theory influences her thinking and helps her determine what the moral status of an individual is. And as we know, all individuals have moral status. I think that was the key things that we covered. Let's look real quickly at what we'll be covering starting, today, week 4. Again, I said I made this video 3 times, so hopefully this one will get to you. We'll be looking at the very, very heavy topic of death, dying, and grief. Oh, boy. Well, it's a reality, and especially a reality for the context in which you work. Death is a subject that is interesting, especially for Christians. It's something that we all know is inevitable, yet it's something we want to talk about. One of my, if there is such a thing, favorite books on death is called, and I'm going to give this to you in a resource, Western Attitudes Towards Death. And what this says is that there's a different culture and a different belief about death in the Western world as opposed to in other cultures. One of the greatest quotes that I remember from this book is that the author said that Western people my lack of a better word, I use the word splendorize because that's my favorite sugar, splendor. They make everything so sweet. They make death sweet, they won't even say it. So he calls the word death in the Western hemisphere the pornography of death. When we think of pornography, we think of shame, we think of secret, something we don't want anything to know about. He says this because he says even in the Western world, we've come up with our own colloquial phrases or nomenclature to assign to the word death. i.e., an example in the hospital when I was a chaplain, and I wonder if you've heard this as nurses. The person passed away. He said, what does that mean? And we talked about this in my CPE class. We don't pass away. Where are we passing to? Or he says another famous one. The person expired at 11:48 p.m. And my supervisor asked me, what does that mean to you? I said, that's strange. That's awkward because people don't expire. I'm from New York. You put a coin in a parking meter. Parking meters expire, but people don't expire. Well, that kind of holds some truth to what Aries is saying about there's a pornography, a shame of death, that we can't even say the word death. We know it's difficult, but that we can't even say it. So we'll be looking at death, dying, and grief. We'll be looking at the famous Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. And the last time I thought I studied, I thought they added a stage, but I could be incorrect. And then we'll be looking at some of the philosophical and scientific definitions of death, because there are different definitions of death. And I think that's the things that we'll be predominantly covering. Oh, and we'll be looking at death in relation. This is very important. I apologize. We'll be looking at death in relationship to what the Christian narrative says. Remember, we are a resurrection people. Our hope is in the resurrection. And so there is a way in which we as professed Christians are supposed to view death. Remember what Paul says, don't mourn like those who have no hope. For me, death is hard. I'm not going to be sugarcoat that. I'm not going to splendorize that. But I pray that I remember what Jesus said, that when someone I love dies, I pray for peace, because he said, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. For in my Father's house there are many mansions, so that where I go, there you may be. And so there's some comfort in knowing that, because Jesus resurrected, and we're a resurrected people. We are people who are resurrected in the hope that we will rise one day all with Christ. And so death doesn't have a final word, right? Jesus says, oh, death, where is thy sting? Oh, grave, where is thy victory? And so we'll be looking at that together. I will look forward again. The posts have been wonderful. They've been substantive. What makes a substantive post? Pull your references in, pull your anecdotal experiences in, and that makes it a substantive post. Please be mindful that I am praying for you, that I encourage you, that I invite your questions. Let's just all be respectful of one another and be considerate of one another. And if there's anything that I can do to be helpful, please do not hesitate to post a personal question in the individual form, or a question that may be helpful to your cohorts in the Question to Instructor form. Well, may the peace of our Lord Jesus Christ bless you and keep you all the days of your life. Peace.